This video is going to be a summary of kind of the lead up to the creation of the Constitution and then ultimately the type of government that is created in the Constitution. Okay, first things first, I just wanted to kind of lay out some of the initial key terms that we're going to be working with and discussing in this video. And the first really is just a constitution, right? We're going to be talking about the U.S. Constitution. So what is it? A constitution, as a definition, is just simply a document that sets out laws, principles, organization, and a process of government. Another term that I want you to look at, and we're going to be discussing as well later in this video, is the idea of a Bill of Rights. So a Bill of Rights is actually the first 10 amendments of the United States Constitution, but a definition of a Bill of Rights is simply just a list of freedoms that the government promises to protect for the individuals or even the states. The last key term that I want to talk about is the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were ratified in 1781, and it was an agreement between the states at the time, and it's a document that essentially creates a loose confederation of states and different rules and things that these states need to follow. So the initial structure of the colonies was really broken down into colonial governments. State governments, they really came about, and followed the same path as these colonial governments, basically after the war. And basically, you had two different branches in each of these states. You had the legislature, which were elected officials, and they were there to pass laws. And you ultimately had the executive, which was the governor of the state, and they were there to carry out and execute the laws. And basically, what happened is that during the Revolution, you had the Continental Congress decide and feel that they really needed these states to essentially have some sort of unification to win this war. And there were certain little things that needed to be able to be done as a bit of a more of a central authority. So the real problem became, however, that many of the colonists were actually more loyal to their states than the nation as a whole. But what you get is what's called the Articles of Confederation. In the Articles of Confederation, what they did was essentially create this loose alliance between the 13 independent states. Each of the states, they really had one vote, and you had this Congress that, each of these states would vote in, and the Congress could do things like declare war, appoint military officers, coin money, they dealt with foreign affairs and things like that for all of these 13 states. So that, each of these states, one state couldn't have a treaty with a different country or something like that. They were all unified in this United States of America in the Articles, through these Articles of Confederation. But there were a lot of limitations that came about with the way that this document was written. And essentially, some of the limitations really came down to that in order to approve anything, you needed at least 9 of the 13 states to approve the law. But not only that, the states couldn't regulate trade. They actually couldn't tax. The central government, couldn't regulate trade. You couldn't tax. It was actually ultimately up to the states to enforce the laws, and there really wasn't any court system. So some of the problems, especially with the taxation and things like that, it really became a big deal because if you needed money, you basically needed to have the states agree to give the money, and you couldn't levy taxes and you couldn't raise taxes yourself as this central government to pay for things. And that was a major problem for sure. And the weaknesses really became exposed in a number of different ways. First, you had a number of land disputes that basically the states would fight with one another over who owned what land. And this was big up in the north between actually New York State and Vermont. And you also had problems coming down to money, right? You had all of this debt from the war, and without the ability to tax, essentially, they couldn't repay it. And what happened is the government actually started printing currency. And what happens when you print currency, and continuously print currency, basically to pay for things, it creates more in the money supply and basically makes all of the dollars worth less. So that's actually called inflation, and that's what the printing of the currency did. So states, when essentially you had this federal government printing its own currency that was not really worth much because of this inflation, the states even started printing their own currency. And this really caused a lot of confusion between the states and, what dollars could be used where and what. But otherwise, you had other problems besides the money and the land disputes. You had actually just other countries that had to be dealt with. So basically, Great Britain actually was ignoring some of the stipulations of the Treaty of Paris, and you had people, you had some of their troops refusing to withdraw from troops, in the Ohio River Valley. And you had Spain causing some problems as well, closing down New Orleans at the time, which they owned, to American shipping that ultimately needed to be dealt with in some capacity too, and you needed a relatively strong central government in certain cases to be able to handle some of these things, since the document was written in the way that it was. So one of the things that happened in the interim between the United States winning its independence from Britain and then ultimately the creation of the Constitution and the ratification of the Constitution was these land ordinances. And the first one in 1785 is essentially divided the Northwest Territory into what is called townships. And each township was actually divided into 36 different sections, each section of 1 square mile. And what happened was Congress was planning to sell these sections to settlers to have land and to have their own stake in this country for money and to basically raise some funds and things for what they wanted to do. And one section in every township was actually going to be set aside for things like public schools and things like that. So this is a map of what I was just talking about. As you can see, you have each of these townships, these sections, basically broken down into squares. And actually, when you go out west into the country, well, west from where I am anyway, on the East Coast, you have this these basically townships that are broken down into squares, unlike the towns and townships and borders and things like that that you see on the East Coast. And you have these townships, and this is kind of the map that shows it, right? So this is a snapshot of actually eastern Ohio here that you can see, and you can actually see, the river obviously messes up the borders of some of those squares over on the eastern side. But so this is right here, as you can see where my mouse is. So this map now is basically what that section represents, right? So they broke that down further into these smaller squares that are 36 square miles, and each section in that was then 1 square mile. So basically that got broken down even farther, and you have sections of these square miles that you can essentially buy as a settler moving west. You can buy a certain number of acres. A half section is 320 acres. You have a quarter section 160, and you can break it down even further than that. And this land was up for grabs for people that wanted to buy the land from the government. So the next ordinance was called the Northwest Ordinance, and that was in 1787, and it essentially set up government for the Northwest Territory and essentially outlawed slavery in those territories as well. And the big thing that came out of this was, obviously that you have these territories now outlawing slavery, but also the fact that, this is essentially a way to admit new states into the country, so that they had these stipulations that once a territory would have 60,000 settlers in it, that it could actually ask Congress to become a state, and if Congress approved, you would get this new state. So the Northwest Territory, which you saw on the map just before, the stipulation was that this had to be broken up into new states. It couldn't be fewer than 3 because otherwise the states would get too large, and then it couldn't really be more than 5 is what they were saying. Otherwise, they would be too small. So those states are going to be formed, and you're going to see those in just a second. The states that actually enter the Union based off of the Northwest Ordinance and the stipulations there or can actually be seen on this map right here. You have Ohio actually enter in 1803, Indiana in 1816, Illinois in 1818, Michigan in 1837, Wisconsin in 1848, and Minnesota actually in 1858. Obviously getting a good deal away from the actual creation of the Constitution and the ratification, but that's how long it took for these areas in the Northwest Territory to gain the amount of population that they needed in order to become states. So you can see these states right here for that. Now that we've taken a bit of a step away from the Articles of Confederation and the problems that were going with that for just a second, let's go back to that. And there was a big problem and some trouble that came out after the war. You actually had this period of depression, and just the definition of depression is just simply a period when business activity slows, prices and wages fall, and unemployment rises. And what happened was that these farmers who had borrowed money basically to help meet the demand of the war, what happened is once the war stopped and once the war was over, they still had all of these supplies and things that they had been providing for the war, and they still owed money to be able to have gotten that stuff in the first place to provide for the war. So when the demand dropped, it left them with this debt and low prices, and essentially it really hit these farmers that couldn't pay off this debt. And some states even raised taxes in hopes of being able to get money, that are going to be able to pay off these debts from the war, and that's going to be a problem for these farmers. So what happened was you had these farmers that had essentially an economy based completely off of bartering, uh, now owing taxes and owing actual currency to their government and unable to pay it. And they were unable to pay their debts for those exact reasons as well. So what you get is actually called Shays Rebellion. It's a group of these farmers led by a man named Daniel Shay, who was a Massachusetts farmer and a veteran of the American Revolution. He is able to gather up a number of his friends and a large number, rallies a support, over 1,000 farmers in the area. And what they do is they actually go and attack courthouses and basically looking to wipe away some of this debt that they had, and basically preventing the seizing of farms from people who couldn't pay back this debt. And it's a big uprising, and this is a big cause of concern for the founders and what they had planned and the ideals of the revolution in the first place. And as a result, you're going to actually this rebellion gets put down. Ultimately, it doesn't succeed, of course, but there were some major issues because how can they deal with this, right? There was no central authority to actually send the military without calling all the states to vote and things like that from the Articles of Confederation. And it was a major problem, and it took a while for this to kind of be dealt with from a federal standpoint. So what happens, you have now these founders and these people that are worried about their own best interests. Some of these really important people that you talk about: Washington, Jefferson, Adams, all these people that don't want something like this to ever happen again, because it would go against their best interests and the interests of the revolution completely. And so they get nervous, and what they do is they end up calling what's called the Continental Congress in to Philadelphia, where they're going to finally meet and kind of discuss and resolve some of these issues of the Articles of Confederation. And they start to meet in May of 1787. This is a map of the United States in 1787 at the time of the creation of the Constitution and kind of the time period that we are discussing right now. So you can see, along the eastern seaboard there, you have these settled areas in red, and as you go west, you still have these frontier areas the land that we had essentially taken from the British in the American Revolution, and basically this was now going to be filled, of course, at some point, but there hadn't been so much push westward yet until a bit later here in this story. So as I said, the Constitutional Convention is called into Philadelphia in 1787, and it is a number of these men, these prominent men in America, that basically decided that they needed to come together and address those problems of the Articles of Confederation, and for their own interests, and to them in consideration, the interests of everyone in the country as a whole. If these rebellions and things like that are going to keep popping up, and these problems, there needs to be ways to deal with it, for the good of the whole, essentially. And there's a whole lot of different opinions about the rebellions in the first place. People like George Washington really felt that it was quite an embarrassment, that only a couple of years after the winning of the revolution in the first place, do you have these problems arising at all in this country, and that it's was a major thorn in their side, essentially, and that they needed to figure out a way to do it, to fix this. And people like Thomas Jefferson actually might argue a little bit different of the case, and basically saying how revolution is something that's going to keep their government in check, and that revolution from time to time is actually a good thing because it shows the government, that it needs to basically be relevant to the people, and if it's not, then the people are going to hold them accountable. So the Constitutional Convention begins in Philadelphia in 1787, and you have delegates, invited from all over the country, basically looking to improve the Articles of Confederation. They didn't really intend to start with a new document and create a new document, and that's ultimately what's going to happen. But the idea was to originally just improve upon the Articles of Confederation. Actually, funny enough, Rhode Island didn't actually attend, but there were actually 55 delegates that attended from all of the other states. So just some general know-how about the convention. George Washington was actually asked to preside and lead over the convention, and another man named James Madison, who's going to be important a little bit later in the story as well, kept notes, and the discussions, and basically his writings and his notes essentially dub him, this father of the Constitution. Just all of the men and all the delegates and all the people that wrote the Constitution and debated the Constitution are typically known as the Founding Fathers. But I think the big thing to note, right, is that pretty much all of them really, are members, they're wealthy white males of the convention, and they are 100% looking out for their own best interests. If you have an armed populace that's revolting, it puts your own interests in check if you're one of these people, and they are trying to make sure that this can't happen again. And you're going to get a lot of debate over the powers of the federal government, and the ratification of the Constitution in general that we're going to be talking about later in this video. So some of the issues that divided the nation at the first place was really just how much power should the federal government have? Should the federal government have the most, or should the states? How is this all going to come together, and what are they ultimately going to decide? Another big issue is this idea of representation in Congress. How many members are each of these states going to get in Congress? Obviously the small states are going to want equal representation compared to the large states, and the large states are going to feel that they want more. They want to be based off of population, and that they're going to want more representation because they represent a larger number of people. And then another one was just slavery. There was a lot more slavery, obviously, in the South because of the way of life, existing down there. You do have slavery, obviously, in the North, but nowhere near to the extent. How are slaves going to be counted in all of this? Is the slave trade going to be allowed to continue, and things like that? So you get what's called the Virginia Plan. And the Virginia Plan was calling for this new national government and throwing out the Articles of Confederation altogether. And they opted and were hoping for three separate branches of government, a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. But ultimately, the thought was that they wanted representation in the legislative branch to be based completely off of the population of the state, which makes sense because Virginia was the largest state at the time as far as population goes, and they wanted more representation in Congress because of that. So, obviously the large states were going to like this plan, the ones with more population, and the small states are not going to appreciate this idea too much. So in contrast to that, you have the New Jersey plan, which is also known as the small states plan. And this idea was just to kind of keep the idea that the legislature would have one house and that each state simply would just get one vote. That each state would then have equal representation in Congress, in the legislature, and this would obviously be beneficial to the small states. And the large states hated the idea because to them, why should a state like New Jersey, which has less population and is significantly smaller than Virginia, have the same amount of representation as Virginia? So ultimately, there was going to need to be some sort of compromise between the two. And that's what you get. You get a compromise, and it's known as the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise is essentially that the legislature is actually going to have two houses. It's going to be something that's called bicameral, and that each house, you're going to have the House of Representatives and a Senate. And the House was actually going to be based off of the population of the state, and the Senate was going to have equal representation. So they kind of took both ideas and melded it together, and this Senate would have ultimately 2 senators for each state. Another compromise that had to be made for the creation of the Constitution and the ratification of the Constitution is actually known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. And this was necessary because if this stipulation wasn't addressed, basically the southern states would have simply just refused to ratify the Constitution, and they needed the states to agree to the Constitution, otherwise it couldn't really become the law of the land, now could it? So this compromise is obviously a really tough one because it was needed to be done in order to kind of get this all started. But for the North, it sort of was a terrible compromise because it sets the stage for slavery to now be the later generation's problem. And the deal was that each of the North and the South wanted to get their best interests here. And the South really, they wanted slaves to count as far as deciding numbers in the House of Representatives for representation. And the North obviously wanted to limit this as much as possible because if there was a relatively large number of slaves in the South, so by counting these people as population, the North didn't have as many slaves. So to them, this would create an advantage for the South in the House of Representatives, and they wanted to now limit this as much as possible. And the agreement that came to was that essentially that slaves would actually count for 3/5 of a person in deciding this representation in the House of Representatives. And remember, the House of Representatives, it is decided essentially by what's known as a census, which occurs every 10 years. And they draw, the lines in Congress, and they essentially decide, how many members of the House of Representatives that each state will get based off of the census. So if there's more people in the South, then they're obviously going to have more people representing them. And then the other stipulation of this Three-Fifths Compromise was simply that Congress could not take any action to ban the slave trade until at least 1808. So now that we have that kind of sorted out and the compromises that needed to be kind of met before this would really even be worked out, it's time to talk about the actual nitty-gritty of the Constitution a bit. For starters, the Constitution lays out 3 different branches of government. The first is the legislative branch, which is responsible for essentially making laws and legislation, and a few other powers which we're going to be talking about in a bit. The executive branch, which's job is to enforce laws and execute the laws and is the office of the president. And you have the judicial branch, which is the court system, and their ultimate role is going to become to determine the constitutionality of laws. The Constitution is laid out in a number of articles, it's called, and each of these articles have subsections that basically lay out the different branches of government. And Article 1 happens to deal with the legislative branch, and it deals with the House of Representatives and how the House of Representatives is going to be set up. And it basically deals with, who can become a representative and ultimately what they are responsible for. Today, the House of Representatives actually has 435 members, and that number is currently unchanging. And all that changes is sometimes, on a census, based off of the census, some states may lose a couple representatives, and some states may gain a couple of representatives based off of population gains and losses across the country over the 10-year periods. But the House of Representatives is meant to be really your local representation, and it's going to be based off of state districts. Each state has a certain number of districts. Your smaller states are going to have typically less than your larger states based off of population anyway. And basically the larger states like California and New York have a good amount of representatives, and some of the states that are less populous, say Wyoming, have significantly less. And these districts are going to be drawn based off population centers and things like that to ultimately decide. So the representative is essentially someone who is locally your representative. So if you have a problem going on in your local area, they're typically the person that you should talk to. And in order to become a representative, they actually serve 2-year terms, and you need to be at least 25 years old and having been a citizen of the United States for at least 7 years. That's a big difference between what we're going to talk about with the president later, where you can actually be someone that's not born in the United States and be a representative or a senator, versus say the presidency, where you can't actually do that. You need to be a natural born citizen. So the Senate, in the contrast that a little bit, is actually 100 members, because remember, there's 2 per state, so there's 100. There's 50 states, so there's 100 members today. And senators actually serve 6-year terms, and you need to be at least 30 years old to be a senator and have been a citizen for actually 9 years. And each state is going to get 2, as I just said. So the big deal of Congress is essentially to create laws and draft laws and get those laws to the president to either sign or not. And this is the diagram that we drew in class. And I'm using this here because it should be more familiar to you guys than if I just picked something off of the internet here. But essentially, remember, this can happen from both directions, right? So remember how we just said that the representative, your House of Representative, or just simply a congressman, they are dealing with local people a lot more than the senator, which has a little bit of a larger area to deal with per state, right? So what happens, however, is typically when a person has an idea that they think should be addressed by Congress, or there's something that's going on, they bring them to their representative. So let's just say we're going to start on the House of Representatives side for the sake of this argument. So the person has the idea and they bring it to the congressman, which I can show you. You can see where the mouse is kind of going along, right? So if the congressman thinks it's a good idea, what they can then do is actually called sponsor the bill. So when they sponsor the bill, it basically puts their name on it, and they draft some sort of legislation that can essentially be brought into this system. So once they sponsor the bill, they bring it to what's known as committee. And there are a number of committees and even subcommittees in Congress that are all meant to deal with certain things, right? Might have a education committee, you might have a science committee, and things like that. And the members of these committees are typically meant to be people that have some sort of knowledge and maybe even expertise on these subjects. So if the idea, let's just say, had to deal with agriculture or something like that, it might go to a committee that deals with agriculture. So once it gets to committee, you have the number of people, typically from both parties today, that basically talk and discuss and debate this sponsored bill. And if ultimately it gets decided that might be a good thing and should be voted on, it's actually going to go to the House of Representatives at that point. They'll bring it actually to the floor, and they actually can vote on it. So at any point along this line, this bill can just die, right? If it doesn't get through a congressman, that idea doesn't get through a congressman, it's not going to go anywhere. If it doesn't get sponsored, it's not going to go anywhere. If it doesn't get to committee, it's not going to go anywhere. If the committee decides they don't want to bring it to the floor of the House, then it's not going to go anywhere. So once it gets to the House, say it goes through all of those, and say it does. Basically, it's debated on the floor of the House, and then they can either decide to pass it or not pass it. If they don't pass it, again, the bill just simply dies. If they do pass it, however, it essentially is going to go now to the other house of Congress, the other chamber of Congress, which in this case example would be the Senate. And it actually has to go through a very similar process all over again. Obviously, it doesn't need to have a person, come up with the idea again, but it does need a senator to sponsor the bill, and it's going to then go to committee, and they're going to talk about it, and they might actually make changes to the bill in certain cases. But for our argument, again, let's just say they don't actually create any changes to the bill, and it goes again to the Senate floor. If the Senate decides to pass it, and both the House and the Senate need to pass it using a simple majority, so they simply just need one more than half of the amount of votes that are cast. If both houses have then passed the bill, and it needs to be the same bill, if either house changes the bill, it then needs to go back to the other one for voting again until they both agree upon the same one. If they've both passed it now, it then goes to the president. And the president can do a couple of different things. For starters, if the president likes it, he can just simply sign it, and then that bill actually becomes a law. If the president doesn't like it, he can actually veto it. And that is one of the big powers of the president. If the president vetoes the bill, what happens is it actually goes back to the House in which it originated in. And if the houses actually vote this time more than 2/3 of a majority, then the bill will actually still become a law, surpassing, overturning the veto of the president, and it will still become a law. Additionally, if the president, does not actually act on a bill while Congress has been in session for 10 days, then it can actually become a law too, but that doesn't really happen too much, if ever. Okay? So there are a lot of other powers that the legislative branch also has and that they vote on. For starters, they have that, the power to create laws, which we just basically talked about. They also have the power to levy taxes. They have the power to borrow money on the credit of the United States, regulating commerce between nations and even states. They deal and make the rules as far as naturalization, what it takes to become a United States citizen. The legislative branch actually are the ones that declare war, a lot of the time at the behest of the president, but not always. They are also responsible for raising and supporting the Army and appropriating funds for the Army and the armed forces, and these appropriations come in 2-year blocks, which is actually really important because every 2 years it needs to be reappropriated, and that can become a bit of a deadlock in Congress as far as getting these things passed. So also, this is where spending bills originate. So as far as appropriation of money goes and where it's going to go for throughout the country, but they also deal with impeaching officials, which is actually the House of Representatives' role, and then actually as far as approving treaties goes, which is the Senate's job. Article 2 of the Constitution deals with the executive branch, and the executive branch is, again, headed by the president, or just simply the POTUS, P-O-T-U-S, which you can see in parentheses there. It also deals with the cabinet, which are the members of that the president brings in, and all the different secretaries that you can think of. So the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Treasury, and all of those other ones. There's tons of them that all deal with different aspects of government. Also, the executive branch deals with foreign relations, and therefore the appointing of ambassadors are basically run out of the executive branch, and they are appointed by the president. But other powers, include carrying out federal laws and essentially recommending new ones for Congress to hopefully either vote on or do whatever they do. The executive, the president, is the commander-in-chief of the military and ultimately the last say in major military operations and things like that. They direct the foreign policy through ambassadors and discussions with foreign dignitaries. The president signs bills into laws or he vetoes the bills. And the last big one is nominating Supreme Court justices. And Supreme Court justices are important because of what we're going to be talking about momentarily. Article 3 is the dealing with the judicial branch, and the judicial branch in the setting up, in Article 3 discusses the creation of the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court actually has 9 justices today. You have one justice that acts as the Chief Justice and essentially the leader, in certain things. But the big thing here is that these judges are appointed for life. And that's really important. The idea that they are appointed, for life is meant to kind of free them from public opinion. These people are appointed by the president for specific reasons. They are typically constitutional scholars or, really, really big name judges and things like that in the federal circuits typically. And these people are chosen typically for their moral character and such by the president, or meant to be anyway. And these people are meant to have their interpretations of the Constitution, and they're meant to be unchanging in certain cases. They're meant to have this interpretation, and they don't want to be swayed by public opinion, right? Imagine if a judge was elected and essentially they had made rulings based off of something that the public didn't want. So the next time the election came around, they could be voted out. That might actually change how the judge would rule on something, and that the whole point is that they wouldn't be subject to this. And some of the powers that are done by the judicial branch, typically the big one is known as judicial review, and that's going to be kind of set a bit later, and it's not explicitly written in the Constitution, but it's going to be kind of declared and set the precedent set from a later Supreme Court ruling that we'll be talking about in a later video. But judicial review is essentially this idea of determining whether or not a law is constitutional or not. And what the judicial branch in the Supreme Court does is when they make rulings, what has happened is that these rulings are meant to set precedents. And a precedent, by definition, is an earlier event or action that is regarded as an example or guide to be considered in subsequent similar circumstances. So when the judicial branch makes a ruling, it sets this precedent that basically all of the other branches of the judicial branch and all the court systems lower than the Supreme Court are meant to make rulings based off of how the Supreme Court has ruled these decisions. And that's really, really important, because with the judicial review and things, that's basically how you get things determined unconstitutional or not, and big ticket social things like just recently the approval of gay marriage. That went through the Supreme Court, and their ruling there set the precedent that gay marriage is to be accepted across the nation in all of the court systems, and that's the law of the land. Just a relatively simple flowchart to understand, of how the court system works, and then ultimately how the appeals process works a little bit too, and how it gets to the Supreme Court. So I kind of look at this map, this flowchart, and kind of see really 3 different levels. The first being on the bottom here. You basically have the local courts, the local trial courts, and then the federal district courts, which are essentially just local districts in the federal circuit, right? You have the state courts and you have federal courts, right? So these local trial courts, if something goes wrong in your state, that's state law, not necessarily federal law, it's going to go through the state circuit, right? It's going to go up, through the state state trial courts, the local trial courts, and then if it's not resolved there and someone wants to appeal, which is your right, if the appeals court is going to hear it, it'll go up to the next level as 2. So that, the next level above those local courts and the U.S. federal district courts is the appeals courts, the appellate courts. And the federal government obviously has one of these, and so does the state. They each have their own, and it's kind of level number 2 in this, if you're talking. So basically, the appeals courts, they make big decisions, obviously, and these cases can also set certain precedents for the courts below them if there's been no Supreme Court ruling on anything like that as well. So the next level above the appellate courts, on this anyway, you have to take into consideration kind of like level 2.5. The states have the highest state courts of appeals, which are typically your state Supreme Courts as well. So those are higher than the appellate courts in the state. So it's kind of like level 2.5 before you get to level 3, which is the actual U.S. Supreme Court, which actually has jurisdiction over all of the court systems in the United States. One of the things that the founders put into the Constitution purposely is using the idea of separation powers and keeping that in mind. And this is known as checks and balances. And essentially, the founders really didn't want any branch to have too much power. And to them, this checks and balances was essentially the solution. So this is just another kind of chart that discusses and shows a lot of the different checks and balances that are there in our government. Basically, each branch has different ways that they can kind of check the other one, so that all the power doesn't fall to the one. And the big example is obviously with the bill to law process and laws in general, right? They're originated in the legislative branch in Congress. And they have to go to the president for signing, so they have to go to a separate branch to get approved in the first place. And to put a check on the president's power even further, right, if the president vetoes the bill and doesn't want the bill, then Congress still has a chance to actually overturn that veto, right? And then at the very end, right, the judicial branch determines whether or not that law is actually constitutional or not. So, there's a number of other ones as well if you were to read the Constitution and if you follow this chart, but I think that's like the most clear example of how this checks and balances work. So if you look at the chart here and look through your notes and things like that, you can get a better idea of some more of those checks and balances. So during the debate over the Constitution, you essentially get 2 major camps, and almost your first 2 political parties, if you will. And these are known as the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And the Federalists get their name deriving from the word federalism, and federalism is defined as simply just a system of government in which entities such as states or provinces share power with a national government. And the Federalists really believed in having a pretty strong central government, and that ultimately the government that they had drawn up in this Constitution was essentially created inherently to protect the rights of the individual already and didn't really need much changing. You have a whole series of papers written, I believe it's 85 of them, predominantly written by a man named Alexander Hamilton, but you also have a few from James Madison and John Jay, who are other prominent figures in American history we'll be getting to. But they really were arguing and debating for the need for this stronger central authority and ultimately for the states to come together and ratify this Constitution. And they came together and wrote these papers, and that became known as the Federalist Papers. On the other side of this coin was the Anti-Federalists. And the Anti-Federalists were obviously pretty much the exact opposite. They really didn't care for the idea of a super strong central government, and they really believed that a lot of the power should have been mostly left to the states or even the individual. And they believed that giving the government too much power would essentially lead to many of the same issues that the United States had in the first place with Great Britain, with the monarchy in place, and they didn't want these issues to become prominent again. again. So what they were advocating for as far as the Constitution is concerned is they were advocating for amendments to the Constitution that were essentially going to protect the rights of the individuals and the states. And this is going to be known as the Bill of Rights and be called the Bill of Rights. And what came out of this is essentially that many of the states decided they really weren't going to ratify the Constitution unless this had unless it had the Bill of Rights in it. And you can, if you're in the actual PowerPoint following along, you can, click that link to the actual full text of the Bill of Rights if you want. But this right here is a really, obviously, really simple breakdown of the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution that become known as the Bill of Rights. So the First Amendment is the amendment that deals with the freedom of speech, your religion, freedom of press and petition and assembly and those kind of things. Your Second Amendment deals with your rights as an individual to bear arms. The Third Amendment deals with quartering of soldiers. Your Fourth deals with how the procedure for arrests and searches and seizures goes, and unreasonable search and seizures and your protection against that. Number 5 is basically the rights of people accused of the crimes, and you should be looking at the actual text along with these simplified versions of it. Number 6 is rights of the person on trial for crimes. Number 7 deals with kind of the jury trial cases in civil cases, in individual smaller cases, not necessarily all the way up the scale in the court system. Number 8 sets limitations on bail and no cruel and unusual punishment. 9 deals with kind of more individual rights kept by the people and protecting some kind of finer rights there. And then lastly, the 10 is essentially powers kept by the states, and saying that states have power that isn't necessarily declared in the Constitution, and that anything that's not declared in the Constitution is basically left up to the people and the states. Okay, so that's kind of just a sum up of really the United States government, and a quick glance into how it all interacts and works together. So thanks for listening.